And it's my pleasure to introduce Andrew Aydin and Dr. Veronica Watson. Let me go to the website real quick and actually didn't get a chance to, but read their bios real quick. So Andrew Aydin is an Atlanta native. He was raised by a single mother and grew up reading everything, particularly comic books. After college, he took a job with Congressman John Lewis in Washington. A year later, while serving as press secretary on the Congressman's re-election campaign, he had the idea that Congressman Lewis should write a comic book to tell the story of his involvement in the civil rights movement. And that became the March trilogy, which was also done with Nate Powell. And it was the first comic ever to win the National Book Award and reach #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. And that comic was inspired actually by, I think, a Martin Luther King Jr. comic, which I may talk about a little bit as well. So he actually mentioned that a little bit later in his thing. I apologize. He wrote the first history of the 1957 comic book, Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story, for his master's thesis. And he served as a digital director and policy advisor to Congressman Lewis in DC. And Dr. Veronica Watson is a professor in the Department of English and director of graduate studies in literature and criticism, convener for the Frederick Douglass Institute Collaborative, a Pennsylvania state system of higher ed. She has a specialization in African-American literature and teaches, publishes, and presents on a range of topics, including Black detective and crime fiction, Southern American literature, civil rights literature, Black feminism, and critical race and critical whiteness studies. She is the author of The Souls of White Folks, which is a great book, just as March is. African-American Writers Theorize Whiteness. And she's the co-editor of Unveiling Whiteness in the 21st Century Global Manifestations. Those books, along with March and the Souls of Whiteness, can be found on the book list. And she just published the short stories of Frank Yerby from the University Press of Mississippi. So she's very much engrossed in Yerby, just as I am, who I think is an author that really speaks, like I said, to these discussions. She secured multiple grants totaling over $600,000. She completed her graduate work at the University of California at Berkeley before earning her MA and PhD in English from Rice University. And those are the introduction. So welcome, Andrew and Dr. Watson.
Thank you. It's good to see you again, Andrew. Little pictures, right?
Hang on, I was muted. Let me thank Matthew and Veronica. It's good to see you again.
Yes.
My lip syncing there.
No problem, no problem. So like our previous panel, Andrew and I have had one conversation together and it was good, it was rich. And so we decided that this would be a little more conversational, kind of going off of each other. I have a few comments to open us up and then I pass the baton and then we go into a conversation and invite you all in for questions. So that's the way we'll go. So the title of our panel is How Do You Dream? Imagining Futures in Literature and Politics. And this was one of those really beautiful statements that Andrew, he dropped a lot of them as we talked. So this was one of the things that he said that I just really kind of fell in love with. And at the time we were really trying to think about the importance of Congressman Lewis's work and his legacy shortly after his passing. And we were also talking about our own futures and what the future holds as we go forward. And so the theme of how do you dream really came up, and we thought that it was sort of a fitting title to frame a conversation about literature in some ways, and then thinking about politics. So I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction of my own work here, and then, as I said, pass it on. In 1860, William J. Wilson, writing under the pseudonym Ethiop, published the article entitled, "What Shall We Do with the White People?" An irreverent essay that turns 19th century debates about the fitness of Black people for citizenship on its head by raising questions about the ability of white people to engage in self-government and the body politic. In it, Ethiop argues that white Americans are marked by their persistent, as he says, quote, discontent and disaffection, disrespect for all manifestations of humanity and violence. After tracing their turbulent history, he wonders what caused this discontent, this unquiet state, this distress, and concludes, like a man who commences the life of a pickpocket and changes not his way, becomes not only adept in the profession, but a hardened offender, so also this people. Roughly 100 years later, in 1963, Malcolm X made a similar charge against whiteness when he asserted that the white world is a wicked world, that thrives on indecency and immorality. He claims repeatedly that the way to save the white world is through the cultivation of a spirit of repentance and atonement. Whiteness must cease its evil exploitation of people of color, and it must make material amends for its wrongdoings. James Baldwin, of course, we've heard invoked several times already today, also stressed the importance of white people seeking redemption for the history and legacy of racism in the world, but did so by excavating the cost of racism for white people. He asserts that, quote, the guilt of whiteness remains more deeply rooted, more securely lodged than the oldest of fears. And this weight has called a near fatal distance from his conscience, from himself within the white American. So between 1860 and 1965, writers as diverse as Paul Laurence Dunbar, Zora Neale Hurston, Richard Wright, Anne Petrie, all who've all or who are all known for exhibiting a nationalist consciousness, also published novels that focused on white lives. And that was the body of literature that I was really interested in when I did my first book. Robert Fikes Jr., who's a librarian at San Diego State at one point, coined the term white knife novel to really capture the persistence of Black authors writing fictional texts that revolve primarily around white characters. In addition to the canonical authors that Fikes covered, I also found an additional 20 titles that fell into that category, including little known pieces by authors like William T. Attaway, James Clayton Powell, Chancellor J. Williams, and William Gardner Smith. Some of those names you may be familiar with. The identification of this long history and wide range of white life work took another significant leap forward with David Roediger's compilation called Black on White. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with that one. And he included 51 selections from a number of different genres that included, in fact, cartooning, graphic art, images, photography, in addition to written works. I chose 5 novels out of that huge body of work. And in the process, recovered and resituated writers like Frank Yerby and Melba Patillo-Beals. And I also looked at some non-canonical writings by authors that we're all very familiar with, like W.B. Du Bois, Charles Chesnutt, and Zora Neale Hurston. I coined the term the literature of white estrangement to try to characterize this body of literature that was really interrogating whiteness and trying to offer different ways of thinking about it. The conclusions and interventions that these intellectuals make echo those that we've heard today from our previous presenters. Whiteness as a purposeful disengagement from human community, as the cultivation of paternalistic relationships to people of color, whiteness as an embrace of the feelings of racial superiority built on the shakiest of grounds, whiteness as a way of moving and being in the world that is built on and constituted through the control of space and the presence and access to that space. But also, I would say, premised, rooted in, and beholden to, perhaps even inextricably tied to violence, white loathing in violence, white denial in violence, white women in violence, white psychological defense in violence. Deborah Walker King, who's the author of African Americans and the Culture of Pain, states the case very well when she says that Black pain has been a persistent and essential strategy of Anglo-American nation building and power exchange, a hidden persuasion of US socialization. So this literature of white estrangement that I'm talking about certainly presents and represents white violence as anything but anomalous. James Baldwin says, whiteness has an appallingly oppressive and bloody history known all over the world. From the forced relocation of people and Holocaust of Native Americans to Japanese internment, from whippings and brandings to dismemberment and lynching, from medical experimentation to Jim Crow, from Chinese and Latino labor exploitation to the intentional creation of all white communities in modern day America, there is increasing reason to consider white racial supremacy, injustice, and violence as the bedrock of white social and political identity. In my attempt to bring analyses of space and place to bear on the subjects of white identity and violence is also an effort to challenge and to continue to frame white terror as recurring, persistent, national and international foundation of white subjectivity and nation building. So this is certainly unfortunate, but perhaps we can't avoid concluding that white violence is sort of the center of white identity and sociology and psychology in some ways. And especially when we look at Southern Lit and the experience of civil rights activists like Congressman Lewis. Um, and of course, the contemporary inheritors of that power and that legacy, those of us who are on the front lines of this battle for black and brown and queer and trans lives. You can keep going with that list. So I'm thinking of the question of how do we tell the story of the civil rights movement in our contemporary times? And how do we account for the response of whiteness also in our contemporary times with this idea of white violence being at the center of it? So that's something that Andrew and I didn't talk too much about, but I remember mentioning when we first got on our call together, it was not too long after George Floyd, and I was just like, oh, like I'm done. I'm just ready to kind of fold up my tent and go home. And so I wanted, and I even warned Matthew when I said yes to this invitation that I will be talking about white violence. I don't know how exactly I'm going to do it, but that's all I can talk about right now as a person living in this body. And I also want to sort of offer, as we also open a space up to think about politics, that I've been thinking about and beginning a pilot project that's using Black detective fiction in another white space, one might argue, and that's in policing and law enforcement training. And so I've really been thinking about this interpersonal performance of whiteness and an institutional investment in whiteness, and how literature can work to shake that up, disrupt it, give people other ways of thinking. And maybe we can use that as a model for other spaces that need to be decolonized also. So I will turn this over to Andrew to offer some comments and connections.
Well, first, thank you. I mean, I think that was a very remarkable scene setting, because I think all too often when we have these conversations, there is an attempt to moderate the truth. And I think if anything has guided both my own work with Congressman Lewis and telling the stories of the civil rights movement, it has been, you can't, as the congressman would say, you can't sweep anything under the rug. And I think, what you're saying right now is incredibly important to preface this conversation. As I have, so let me say this. I'm at my mother's house. My mother passed away about 3 years ago. And so her dream was to retire and have a small nursery. She was a gardener. She loved to grow things. And so she came out here to the country in Western North Carolina. My grandmother had retired out here, and for the most part, the people who I've interacted with have embraced me and my career, and what I tend to Google me, and they tend to recognize I stand for something more than they expected. But at the same time, I've got these back neighbors who obviously figured out who I was. I'll never forget driving by. I'm driving on my tractor. I'm bush hogging, and they're out there hammering in tiki torches and saying loud enough for me, saying loud enough for me to hear this, saying like, "We need more tiki torches. They keep the liberals away." And right. And I'm like, I'm on the other side of this. Look, not only am I literally on the other side of the fence, I am for all intents and purposes in the camp of those who they are more than happy to conduct violence against. And that's playing out even today. I put a number of Biden Harris and Mo Davis signs out on the back by their house where it's a stretch of mama's land. Came back the next day, they'd kick the signs down, right? Small act of violence, but nonetheless an act of violence. And so I had to think, like, what would Congressman Lewis do? And so I went and picked up more signs, and now instead of there being 2 signs back there, there's 4 signs, right? They kick them down tomorrow, I'm coming back with 6.
There you go,
right?
there you go.
And to me, that is so much what that is what we're trying to talk about when we talk about white violence, is that there's this idea in the white community that they have moral authority to behave that way, which is if a person of color behave that way, they're going to go to jail, right? Like that's election tampering, right? You're messing with signs. That's a, but there is this privilege, this ideology. And in my own life, I never experienced that sort of privilege, mostly because my father was a Turkish Muslim immigrant. And even though I never knew my father, and even though I was raised by a single mom who was very much a Dutch, Irish, Scottish white lady from Georgia back several generations, she was as much on the other side of the fence as a person of color because she decided to marry a person of color, right? And so in growing up for myself, it was like I became interested in politics out of a sense of righteous indignation at the way my mother was treated. And the community that she created around me as I grew up. I mean, one of my mother's best friends when I was a child was Carolyn Booker, and that's Cory Booker's mom. And when you sort of grow up with that being your living room, right, you're sensitized, you see it firsthand. And I think that, especially if you dig into the way we told the story in March and tried to tell the history, right? You go to book 2, you show the scene of the Freedom Riders being beaten, and we go in depth with the children who participated, because we were trying to dramatize exactly how this hatred and sense of entitlement to violence is passed down from generation to generation. And then hopefully the reader steps back and thinks about it in the context of that child that is gouging out the eyes of a Black freedom rider is now 55, 60 years old, probably not wearing a mask, you know, and they were taught that this generation was handed down hate, and they embraced it. It was their inheritance. The congressman would say it another way. He would say, no baby is born hating another person. And I think that's really what we have to get at, is this, both the sense of entitlement and privilege towards violence and how that is handed down from generation to generation. And I think it's really telling when you look at the administration today and how they are trying to limit Americans' ability to interact with other cultures, because it is those experiences, that sensitization that changes your mind, right? It's like, I think about the political cartoons that showed Jewish people in Europe, and they're portrayed with the noses and the warts and the, you know, and then you meet a Jewish person, you're like, oh, that's not what's in the cartoon, right? But that teaching and training is what creates this cycle of hate and violence. And I think as authors and as teachers, our goal really is to sensitize and inform and find new ways to reach into the hearts of people who haven't been sensitized. And I think this is the part that made John Lewis so unique, is that he could see past the training and the hatred that he was, that these young people were taught, and he could find forgiveness in his heart. I think about the gentleman from Rock Hill, South Carolina, who beat the congressman in May of 1961 on the Freedom Rides there, and how he came back and he apologized to him almost 50 years later, right? And it's the idea that he had been sensitized. He had been shown the better path. He had been shown a more open world, the truth, in a sense, the full picture, and that changed his mind. And I think the hardest part is to be John Lewis, who is to say, yeah, you smashed a Coca-Cola crate over my head. Here are the pictures of me dripping blood down my face. And yet I do not hate you. I forgive you, right? And I think for a lot of us, that's too hard.
It is. It's very difficult. And I'm really thinking, as you're talking about socializing into violence, I'm thinking about Baldwin's short story, The White Man's Burden, where, you know, there's a young white boy who's being taken to his first lynching, and he has repressed this. So we see him as an adult, and he's acting out, and it's during the civil rights period. So he's in fact a police officer. He's beating prisoners that he arrests, and he's withholding care from them. And he goes home at the end of a night and he's struggling, right? And so he can't sleep. He's wrestling with himself, but he doesn't even remember what it is that he's wrestling with. Why there's this unsteadiness and uncertainty about him, because he thinks of himself as a good man. And something about his experience of interacting with Black people is shaking his sense of himself, and I'm just sort of wondering, where are those moments where there's something that's so unsettling about your experience of the world and how you're moving in it, how you think it operates, and yet you see these things happening. Like, how do you reconcile that and continue to think, oh, everything is fine? This is definitely the direction we should be moving forward on, right? Because there's just so much that seems to suggest that the way that you're looking at the world is only a small sliver of it. And for your world to be true, you have to be denying about 90% of the experiences of people in this country, much less the world, right? And so, yeah, I'm just, that really kind of spoke to me, because I think that being socialized into violence also is a process of disassociating from your own humanity and disassociating from yourself. And so when you remember that Congressman Lewis was able to forgive, and that man was able to grow in such a space that he was able to come back and apologize, it gives you hope. But boy, you just don't see that too often anymore, right? Oh.
Well, I think about what Jim Lawson, Reverend Lawson, would say when he would lead these nonviolence workshops. And it was like, so when they're beating you, you look them in the eyes, force them to recognize your humanity, make that human connection. And I mean, like, golly, doesn't that seem also like so too much of a burden on the individual who's being beaten, right? Like, it's also your job to show them you're a human being at the same time as they are trying to dehumanize you. But that's what I think the purpose of this symposium, the purpose of our conversation in many ways is like, how do you shift that burden? How do you get a whole generation to accept that the world that they were told about from their parents is from another era, and that all they're trying to do is preserve this forgotten land? Right?
And a land that never was, right? I mean, it never was the way that their parents are imagining it was. So it really is a creation and a violence to impose that as the reality when it never existed in that way.
Well, I think the South does have to admit that it was and is in some ways to this day incredibly violent towards anybody not part of that white power structure. I think about it too out here in the country where this is an Apple Valley. And so there's this growing Latino community that came over, started about 40 or 50 years ago as migrant farm workers. And now they're taking over shops and everything like that. And there's this uncomfortableness about that. And they're not registering to vote yet. Like, I was looking at and it's like, because they're afraid of that pushback. And then in the context of their fear, right? Because I know where they live, they're not putting out yard signs, they're not doing anything else, right? There's this idea of those of us who pass, right? Or who have like my grandfather out here was the rural mail carrier. So you're gonna leave me alone. You may stomp on my sign, but you're not gonna come after me. It's gonna be like, oh, that's Jack Jones's kid. He's always been the weird one, why is he always like that? Oh, he had the dad, And I think too, for me in my own life, I've always felt the responsibility to sort of set a tone for how I felt like people like me should behave, right? That means spending your life working for 13 years for John Lewis, for the district that you grew up in, and being, for all intents and purposes, one of only like 2 or 3 white folks working for him, right? And spending my 20s trying to tell the story of the civil rights movement to another generation, because I always think back, I grew up in Atlanta, I went to Atlanta public schools for a while, and nobody ever told me about SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Nobody ever told me about the power young people had. I mean, the introduction that we got to Dr. King was very brief. You would go to the King Center, you would watch the video, you would see the exhibit, and then they would say, great, you would believe in justice now, right? And
Yeah.
it was so removed, right? And one of the things, and I'll keep going back to my mother's influence on my life in this way, because when I came up with the idea for March, and it was sort of in that nebulous stage where everybody was like, yeah, John Lewis shouldn't do a comic book, that's really weird. And I'm like, no, this is a big idea. My mother was with me every step of the way in this, because my mother believed in it as much as I did, because we went back to this idea over and over and over again of writing it for that 9-year-old that I once was, who needed to understand his power, and that it was the right thing to do to stand up and to speak up against these societal injustices and the institutional discrimination. Because, at this, like, we can speak to this, where it's like the specific type of discrimination put on women is profound in the South, right? And I think that's why we have this conversation, and it goes down, and we're like, okay, Black women deserve a medal for showing up every day and living their lives, because it's like you're dealing with the racial discrimination and the gender discrimination. And the gender discrimination is significant. I mean, it is. I remember my mom tried to get a loan to buy a house in the late 70s, and the loan officer laughed her out, saying, "Little Missy, where's your husband?" And it's like that. This is an attitude that carried on into like the 80s. I mean, it wasn't. You talk about like Ruth Bader Ginsburg and everything. It was like because of her and this movement. It wasn't really until the 90s that women even had equal access to the financial system.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think when we talk about it in the context of race, we also have to think about it in the context of gender, because it is such a prominent part of it.
Yeah, I certainly agree with you. And a couple of other presenters have really been calling attention to the role of white women in perpetuating whiteness, and so as we talk about how does that socialization happen, we have to give sort of that moment of reckoning that very often that's the work of the woman in the household that is perpetuating that. So I love this narrative that you have about your mother being the person who's just sort of showing you a different road, supporting you in a different path, because very often that's not the case. And it's very striking to me to hear that, oh, yeah, of course, women had other experiences. And of course, they were also impacted by gender discrimination, but there were some who were brave enough to stand up and buck both of those systems, right? Because at the moment that you're standing up, you're bucking both of those systems, regardless of what race you are. And so that's heartening. It reminds me also that, I tell people this all the time, like if I died and before this happened, I would feel like I kind of missed something. At some point as a nation, we have to get to the point where we're celebrating white resistance to these narratives of dominant, oppressive, violent whiteness, right? Because the picture that we have right now is that whiteness is always bad, always has been. The people who say that they're white are enacting it in a particular way. And yet we know that your mother is there in that story, right? We know that there are mothers and there are John Browns and, there are allies, and they always have been there. But we have not gotten to the point where we can acknowledge that as part of the narrative about how we have always been fighting this battle, right? And I think that becomes an important moment of bringing along white people to say, oh, wait, I can do this differently. I don't have to be silent about this. In fact, there's a long legacy of people who were fighting against this, and Lillian Smiths who were standing up and writing out, and I can be that kind of white person, right? And I can embrace a whiteness that has a different vision for how this can unfold and is more interpersonal and interactive than what we're told it is. And so that becomes another way of sort of encouraging, along with the power of literature, which I think both of us are really invested in, of getting people to see that there's another path and another possibility. Because very often, I think when people start this journey, they're starting it in places where they're alone, they're isolated, they're in families where there may not be one other person who's ever spoken a kind word, or they're hearing the racial epithets. So that all of that is part of the reality that you're coming into your whiteness and an understanding of whiteness within. And so how do you become the person who can stand out, stand up, stand with? Well, you got to have some models for that sometimes, especially when they're not in your immediate vicinity. So we need to do a much better job at that.
Well, and even in doing that, I think it's some white folks fail to recognize the trauma of Black folks just from their existence.
Yeah.
And they don't understand when you insert yourself into a situation, there's this, I mean, some Black folks have trauma from dealing with white folks. So why are you surprised that they're hesitant or reticent to help you or work with you or be around you? And then there's this other element to it, which I've actually, so I got Marvel to let me write this as a Captain America story, which is the idea of this white saviorism, right? And all too often white folks come into a community or into a story or into a place, and you saw it during the Mississippi Freedom Summer, right? Where white folks would kind of come down, take the lead, and sort of point Black folks what to do. They don't know what they're doing. They haven't had the education or whatever. I can even remember at one point, I was fixing something for the congressman, and I pointed out that it had gotten messed up. And he was like, well, I didn't go to a fancy school like you did. And I was like, oh God, all right, shots fired, you know? And so and I was like, you know, and there was that moment where it's like, sir, I was on scholarship the whole time. So, and you know, it's that piece of it where, you know, like in the Captain America story, it was Cap went down to Mississippi during the Freedom Summer, and he landed in a farm, and he was all ready to fight the racists who'd come and threaten the people who were trying to register to vote. And so he beats them all up, and he's like, I did it. And the farmer is like, you really screwed it up. And he's like, I don't understand what's going on. Like, why would I? That's what I do. I'm Captain America. And so then he's like, well, I'll protect you tomorrow when you go to register. Right. And so he goes and he watches, and the guy's like, don't come near me. I don't want anybody to see me with a white person walking behind me because it will raise so many questions. And so he goes with him. Nothing happens. They ultimately are able to register to vote. And then they come back, and then their house is burned down. And it was retribution for the beating that Captain America gave to those Klansmen. Right. And it forces him to ask the question, you know, I was created to fight America's enemies, but how do I fight America?
Yeah.
Right. And the consequences of white saviorism. Right. Yeah. Marvel let me do that. I'm like, you know, and it's canon too. It's crazy. It's like an official Captain America story. So I look at it in that context where,
be selling that, by the way. That should be on our list of things that we can buy.
Yeah, it's called Home of the Brave. Yeah. You know, and I think about that in terms of my own allyship, where you know, it's like there are two paths that I could have taken. I could have written March by myself and just kept all the money, gotten all the glory, all that sort of stuff, right? But to me, it was so, first of all, I just wanted to be around John Lewis because we were friends. Like, we liked to hang out. We would go to auctions and like gossip and, you know, late night McDonald's runs and stuff like that, you know? Like we part of the reason I think we did so many events together is because like we really had fun doing them. You know, we would like laugh with each other. And I think one of the things the teachers kept saying to us afterwards is like, they'd never seen a model for that sort of relationship before, right? An intergenerational, racial relationship that was both creative and professional. And, you know, as we're going through this, the other side of this would be like, you know, a lot of folks go out there and it's like white guys trying to write their version of the civil rights movement. But I feel like what you really should be doing is trying to lift up the stories and joining with the actual participants. And I think
go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was just thinking a little bit about what you were saying about allyship, and it was reminding me of my experience when the previous election was happening, and the organizing that was happening. And I was surrounded, I'm in a small rural community in Western Pennsylvania, so in that country, and everyone who was there and, you know, trying to sort of get ready for the midterm elections were mostly white women. I mean, they're progressive white women, but they're white women. And I had to stop going to the meetings because I was traumatized. I was like, okay, y'all just don't really understand how serious this is, because I'm remembering that 86% of white women voted for somebody during the last presidential election. And chances are that some of y'all that are in this room right now were part of that 86%. I just am not buying that you all were part of the 14% who didn't, right? And so, I'm feeling it. I'm feeling it in my body, right? And while all of the words are right, and the thinking that's happening on the walls, on the sheets, and the strategizing, all of that is so good. But I had to stop going because I would walk out of there triggered. I'm just like, I can't, I don't know if I can trust you. I don't know how much I can trust you. I don't know how much I can invest in you because I don't know what's going to happen when you go to that voting booth, right? Who knows? You might be here doing one thing and then you still voting another way because your husband is the one who's determining how you vote, or, so I just, yeah. So that question of allyship really is about building enough of a relationship that you feel like you know this person and can invest in that relationship and feel like it's not going to either be betrayed or you're not going to be betrayed because of how you're interacting. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot that gets us there, right? There's not a lot of opportunity for that kind of deep exchange, those deep conversations. It takes time, it takes patience, it takes forgiveness, it takes a willingness to give people the benefit of the doubt. And everything about whiteness and race and the way that has been constructed in this country prevents or sort of derails those kinds of willingness to give. So yeah, I mean, I love to hear it and see it when it happens. I just think that is so rare. And so when your teachers said, "Well, we just never seen that kind of relationship before. How did you do that?" What to say too. Yeah, how did you do that? I mean,
Well, I think, like, you got to ask yourself a question. Like, have you ever had a person of a different race stay in your house for long periods of time? Right? Like, have you ever had like a person of color, if you're white, have you ever had a person of color stay in your house for a week or two? Or if you're black, have you ever had a white person stay in your house for a couple weeks or two? Right? It's that level of comfort. I remember there was a lot of lessons that I learned explicitly because I didn't have the words for it when I was in school. Right. And I think that's another part of this allyship is showing people that, like, that thing that you sense that is wrong, there are words for it. And there is an actual tangible thing that you can understand it in that context. I mean, I think about college, where there's this whole group of kids who are sort of the frat kids who I was kind of repulsed by. But I thought I was like, oh, they're just the rich kids. But it wasn't just that they had money, right? It was that they were going into that ultra conservative ascot white shirt kind of community, and I didn't have words at the time to understand what it was that I was repulsed by, and also what it was they didn't like about me, right?
yeah,
Because for all intents and purposes, like, it wasn't like, I mean, to be honest, like, I used to go by my middle name because I felt like people, when they saw my last name, that they treated me differently because it's such a Turkish Muslim name.
yeah.
And and my middle name is Van Buren, so it's like the whitest name. It's my mother's maiden name, so it's like they're like, "Oh,
Wow.
Van Buren," and you're like, "Yeah, that guy, right?" But like we've all code switched in that way, like we've all been like, "Okay, I just need to get through this. Like, I don't have
Yeah.
any leverage. I'm on a full ride. If one of these kids says I did something, I'm screwed." Like, you know what I mean?
But it's so funny, Andrew. You went from you didn't go Andrew, you went Van Buren. I mean, so seriously. Wow.
right? Like, but that's kind of like, I think there is a portion of understanding that also has to be for those of us who are in the middle. And I think that is part of why I gravitated so strongly to the Black community in Atlanta, and also just people of color more broadly, because it was like, if you weren't white, like white, then you were part of everybody else. And I think oftentimes, particularly so I hate the word Middle Eastern. I kind of call it West Asian, which I know people are like, okay, that's semantic and weird, but it's like, really, it is West Asia, right? It's not the Middle East. Middle East is a colonialist term created by Europeans who are like, it's on our way to the East. Like, these are the people we ran roughshod over and then took their oil, right? Like, that's, and so those of us who, and I think about this from high school, this is crazy, right? I remember I was supposed to date the other Middle Eastern girls,
Yeah, you told me
right?
about this.
So like the Lebanese, the Iranian, like we were all like, okay, you guys with the little bit of a tan and a little bit more body hair, whatever it is, like it's like you guys stand over there and you segment and fragment out. And I only now at 37 years old do I have the words and the space to understand that sense of being isolated and segregated off into this small block. Because at the time it was just sort of like, and like, I'll never forget, like the rich white kids ridiculed this one Iranian girl saying, oh, she's so ugly, all this sort of stuff, because she had big eyebrows, right? Like, and now it's like, dude, she is a beautiful woman, right? And like, I bet half of those boys, like, but it was that she was other. It was that she was different than them, and they pushed her out the same way. And this may be controversial, but I feel like in some ways, those of us in that kind of community look to the African American community as a model for how to liberate ourselves. Yeah. Right? I mean, because you can't, like, the organization of the Black community is unparalleled. Yeah. Right? I mean, like, I look at the CBC, right? The Congressional Black Caucus, and they are so good at marshaling their forces, sticking together, and bringing their issues home. Right? And other communities are just not as put together and as organized. And that in many ways is also part of what drove my fascination with the civil rights movement, because it is a model for all of us on how to organize and how to come together and how to force change in a society that does not want to change.
Yeah, that's very good. And I'm thinking, I have a graduate student who's doing some work, and she is from Iran, and she's doing African American literature and civil rights narratives. And she's really interested in this idea of literature as being an imagined community where people who are facing similar similar oppressions and trying to liberate themselves in various ways, who don't have a home community network of activists who are doing that work, can turn to the literature of people who have done that work and create those kinds of bonds and sort of moments of sympathy and empathy and understanding, create the language opportunities, right? The growth that happens. And so, yeah, I hear you that that when we're absent of those things, we do need to be able to turn to others who have perhaps had more experience and more strategies developed, more time to develop those strategies. And that can help jumpstart the work that we're doing, right? And also, as you're really, I think, showing us, can create opportunities for allyship that wouldn't otherwise be there, because that those distances can be quite real sometimes. So I really appreciate that. Matthew's back. I wonder what that means.
Yeah. I was just gonna let y'all keep going. I mean, we could go off on comics, because I was thinking about some Jungle Action stories with Caleb, and so yeah, that's an off-panel discussion. I know there are people on Twitter who would get involved with that. We don't have access to the Captain America comic, and I actually need to go. When was that published?
Last year. It's in a graphic. I know this is still in print. Actually, you can get them through my website if you want them.
And if I'm assuming if you have access to Marvel Unlimited, it's on there, right?
Yeah, it should be. And it's in the trade paperback Tales Through the Marvel Universe.
Okay. And he also did a story in Bitch Planet too, which is a great comic dealing with feminism and race and gender and class and a bunch of different stuff. He did one of the stories in one of the triple features there. It's kind of I wouldn't call it blaxploitation, but in the exploitation kind of genre. Which is
I wrote about sexual harassment in government before Me Too, which I was like, it was something that I felt very strongly about, and I don't think a lot of people were paying attention to it at the time. And you use whatever platform you can to draw attention to the issues that you think are important. And I remember I got some feedback from a woman on the Hill who read it, and she was like, I know that moment. And I was like, yeah, I kind of just wrote down what somebody had told me. Like,
I need to go reread that then. It's in my
Yeah.
short box right now. So I'll go reread that tonight.
Yeah.
It's been a little while since I've read it.
Well,
Okay.
and also, if you guys are interested, DC let me write a thing called Battle for the Vote that's being posted on their Instagram every Friday, but they're going to be posters that are like 2 feet by 3 feet. They're going to comic book shops. You might be able to snag one. But Superman calls out voter suppression, and I was really proud they let me do that. And he just straight up calls voter suppression un-American. And so, and then when the president said this thing about I was going to rip my shirt open and show my shirt or whatever, it's been really amazing to see people online use that image and use that story, like throwing it back at him. Like, no, this is what Superman really thinks. Like, get off your horse.
And
Yeah.
two more things. One, if you've never read Captain America giving up or losing his position and then a Southern white man taking it, go and read those. That's like issues 330 or something. It's really interesting. But the other thing I think about too, the Power comics, which I think goes with both of y'all, a character like Miss Marvel, who's still focusing on corporate America, but Pakistani American, Muslim as well, who becomes a superhero basically. So
Yeah.
the Power, and she's been used actually in political activism, I think out in California, right? With when the anti-Muslim ads are on the buses or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
So those types of things are really worth checking out. We don't have those here, but let's get to a couple of questions. We can probably go to about 250. There's a lot here. And I think if y'all want to answer them, you can type your answers when we're done as well. If we don't get to any that we don't ask, because there's some pretty in-depth questions. But one question I want to ask is, what would you say is the first step of progress? You know, is being honest that first step? And I think y'all kind of talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say be a first step. It's so hard to know because I do think that people enter in different places. But certainly, in order for any openness, progress, potential, I think you have to start with a place of honesty, or or maybe I would even say a place of questioning. Maybe that would be the first step, right? Because if you're not even questioning, there's no way to enter into am I being honest with myself, or the stories and narratives that I'm telling myself really are an accurate representation of the world in which I live, so maybe the questioning is the first step. And how do we get people to doubt, to question, to be willing to even ask, is there a different way of doing this? Is there a better way of doing this? And I think we used to have a mechanism that, of course, as our society has become more secular, has lost a lot of its power. But I think that was sort of the power of a moral argument about right? That was anchored in something bigger than the self. And in the absence of that, I've really struggled to try to figure out, how do we get there? How do we get to a place where someone might ask the question, is this right? Is this okay? Am I okay with this being the way the world is structured, so that, 75, 85, 95% of people have less than nothing and the rest have a whole lot of something. And unfortunately, my experience in the classroom with students hasn't really suggested to me that that there is a lot that pushes them to question. And so when they do encounter it, there's a whole lot of pushback on that, right? A whole lot of, oh, hell no. Like, and start spouting whatever the thing is that will get me out of this moment of having to think. So yeah, I think that for me, like, how do we get to the questioning? How do we get people to be willing to engage that conversation where they might acknowledge that what they've been telling themselves isn't a fair representation of the world? Andrew, what do you think?
I mean, I think you said it very, very well. The only thing I would add is that I think we got to get to the point where people are willing to simply see the rest of the world. You know what I mean? Like that's, I feel like that's how they provoke these questions, right? Again, to go back to my mother, one of the things that she did, we didn't have a lot of money, but we had this beat up old Volvo that would not die. And so we would road trip to national parks. And, sometimes you're going into communities that are all different races and ethnicities, right? Because you're driving through them. There's no skipping. It's not flying airport to airport and rich town to rich town, right? Like, it's Motel 6, it's, all that stuff. And I think that early on for me was a huge influence because I got exposed to all these different cultures. In fact, I actually ended up writing an X-Files story based in New Mexico because of the influence of me of a trip my mom and I took to see the kivas, which are like
Mm,
Native American houses in
yeah,
the ground. Yeah.
yeah.
And it was such a profound story, a profound trip that it like had this huge influence on me and it stayed with me my whole life. My mom would, still cook dishes that she learned how to cook on that trip,
Wow.
and I think that's it. We also, and this goes back to also how poverty is used to continue racism, right? Where like, if you can't afford to get out of your bubble, how the heck are you supposed to learn something outside of your bubble?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then we can go into the whole guaranteed minimum income conversation and the fact that like the whole government subsidies are out of whack. And then that's a different policy discussion that I can't have until December 1st. I'm no
But
longer
you
on
know,
congressional payroll.
education was supposed to be the thing that allowed you to get out of that bubble, right? Even if you couldn't afford it. And of course, that's the reason I think that these attacks on various institutions that we have really had as bedrocks of U.S. democracy is so insidious, because education could be the place where those encounters happen, regardless of how much money you have, where you have that opportunity to engage people of different cultures and ethnicities and backgrounds and sexualities, where all of that can happen. But when you defund it, or when you outsource that to homeschooling experiences, or when you outsource that to private institutions where you get a constituency that's pretty homogenous, then you unravel those opportunities for engagement. So yeah.
But some of the more insidious ways that they do that are through the funding structures themselves. It may not even be that they cut the funding, but by making public education fully funded through property taxes, of
Rodriguez.
course the rich areas are gonna.
Yeah.
Did we run out of time?
No, I was just saying, I always tell my students about Rodriguez versus San Antonio.
Yep.
Yeah.
That case, which was basically the case that said it's paid for property taxes. And I think doing research, you can correct me because I know you know more about it than I do, but lower income communities give more percentage wise in their property taxes than higher income communities, right?
Yeah,
Mm.
and I think public education should be federally funded, and we should stop offering subsidies for private education. The charter school network is in many ways siphoning money out of a public education system that was designed to break, and now they're using its breaking as an excuse to create the charter school network.
Right. And I mean, you have to remember that these are whole other discussions too, but they're all connected. After segregation, the rise of private schools. And
Right.
you see the stuff what's happening in Montgomery and or in Birmingham specifically. I mean, there's been recent pieces about that and elsewhere too, about
Mhm.
counties splitting off from the town just to segregate, essentially.
Yeah. I mean,
Anyways,
so many of these schools were founded in like 55, 56, and you're like you weren't
What's
even pretending.
well,
here?
I think it was in The Color of Law, or maybe somewhere else. I've read so much stuff, but wasn't there a school district who basically shut down schools, probably more than one, but shut down schools for multiple years.
Yeah, they're just
Yeah.
like, you just won't have school.
Right. And
Right.
then like my
Absolutely.
mother-in-law in Louisiana, they didn't desegregate until the 70s, of course. And then they were still being forced to desegregate, I think, even when I was there in the 2000s. So
Yeah, and I was in Houston, and I was part of the movement that was desegregating schools, and that was in the 80s, right? So I was being bussed across town so that we would have more integration in the schools, because the suburbs, not even suburbs, they were just areas outside of the main part of Houston, still were lily white, and yeah, working hard to stay that way.
look at Milwaukee, I think, or Detroit and Boston too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's another main thing I always want to tell my students is don't necessarily think it's just the South.
Right.
Student
I heard the N word more times going to school in Connecticut than I did my entire time growing up in Atlanta.
and
Hmm.
I think teaching kids in the South, they need to know that.
Yeah.
That's just my personal thing.
But again, it goes back to getting out of the bubble, going,
Right.
experiencing other cultures, and then building that greater understanding. So
Right,
that's,
yeah.
I'm practicing to be a teacher. I brought it back to the point.
There are more great questions here. We don't have time, but please make sure to answer the questions, Dr. Watson and Andrew, if you can. And one of the people who works with Common Good Atlanta said they actually use March, in the classroom with Common Good Atlanta. So with the incarcerated students.
Oh, hey, if you're doing that, let me know. Once we get where we can go back into these facilities, one of my favorite things to do is visit incarcerated youth. I've been all over the country from California. I even did Cook County and spent a good amount of time there and brought the congressman. I've been up and down the Eastern Seaboard, and I've been really eager to go visit students in Atlanta. So please let me know.
And I can get you in touch with them if you need to. Just
Okay.
just shoot me an email on Twitter. Just shoot me a message on Twitter or email me. I'll get you in touch with them.
Okay, fantastic.
All right.
Making
Right.
connections.
I'll see y'all in 5 minutes. We have Andrew Beck Grace and Connor O'Neill coming up.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
See ya.
Bye. And thank you, Veronica.
Thank you, Andrew.